Let's get more on this with our next guest, Daniel Mitchell. He is senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He joins us live from Washington, D.C. Daniel, thank you very much for being with us. Now that we've had a couple of days to digest some of the information and to hear what some of these political and business leaders are saying, is this more of a perception problem? Because there's nothing illegal about having assets in a tax shelter, or is this more of a conflict of interest problem in your view?
I think there are two stories. First of all, anybody who is successful, who does cross-border economic activity, is an international investor, of course they're going to have structures in places like Switzerland, Panama, Hong Kong, because that's just how you do business. You find a tax-neutral platform, so that makes sense. The other story is whether or not certain politicians may be getting a little bit of graft, a little bit of corruption going on, and they're trying to hide that money from their voters. So this could turn out to be a story about nothing but good old-fashioned political corruption, but there are some people in the U.S. and elsewhere on the left who see it as an opportunity to attack low-tax jurisdictions because they simply favor bigger government and higher taxes.
Daniel, that's the point that you're making, and interestingly you say that this has become somewhat of a beat-up just over recent days as well, and you've actually written quite passionately in defence of Mossack Fonseca. You said recently that the majority of people who use these offshore structures are generally honest and also law-abiding, and Mossack Fonseca is essentially just a paperwork player. Tell us, why are you calling this the never-ending war, as you put it?
Well, because for the last 20 years, we have had the high-tax governments working through bureaucracies like the OECD, where, by the way, the bureaucrats get tax-free salaries, so it's very ironic that they're trying to promote higher taxes around the world. But the high-tax governments, with their unsustainable welfare states, are desperately trying to figure out how they can collect more revenue. They want to eliminate the liberalizing force of tax competition so they can jack tax rates back up to where they were in the 1960s and 1970s, with an average top tax rate of only almost 70%. That's their agenda, and they're trying to demonize anything that's so-called offshore. They're trying to demonize tax avoidance, even though every logical person, of course, nobody would ever pay more than they're legally obliged to pay. So I think this is really an ideological agenda on the left, mixed in with a story of, in a few instances, some political corruption.
Okay, Daniel, I hear what you're saying. It can be an ideological argument for some, but also it's a story of public interest, because there are questions about whether or not there were conflicts of interest. Take a look at the Iceland Prime Minister's case. I mean, he was a member of parliament when he owned 50% of this offshore company with his wife, in which they bought millions of bonds of the Icelandic banks. He did not reveal that until the day before a new law was going to take effect, in which these were conflict of interest laws. So that's one issue. The other issue now is that as Prime Minister, he also was part of the negotiations with these banks after the financial crisis was over. Now that offshore company owned by his wife wants $4 million that they're claiming in losses. In David Cameron's case, I mean, he's being very careful on how he answers questions. He's answering questions in the present tense. He did not answer questions about whether or not his family or he have benefited in the past or will in the future. And he's the face of trying to fight tax avoidance. So in terms of conflict of interest, where do you stand on how much the public needs to know?
I think when it comes to politicians, then transparency is very desirable, because they have such great ability to line their own pockets by tilting the law one way or the other. We have lots of politicians in America. None of them have been named in this Panama leaks thing, but lots of politicians come to Washington without a lot of wealth, and when they leave Washington after 20 years in office, all of a sudden they're wealthy. So yes, that smells. There's something just seems wrong about that, and so you do wonder whether politicians are figuring out how to work the system to their advantage. But I want to underscore something very important. Simply the fact that these politicians use structures set up by Mossack Fonseca does not make the structures illegitimate. It's sort of like attacking General Motors because sometimes bank robbers use their cars as getaway vehicles. legitimate international business and investment is something we should be encouraging, not letting high-tax governments shut down.
Yeah, that's the very argument that the Panamanian law firm is saying that, we can sell the car, but you can't sue us if, that car is involved in a crime. All right, thank you for all the great points you made, Daniel. Daniel Mitchell there from the Cato Institute.